Good afternoon. My name is Dan Campbell and the Methodist Church in Sartonville, Mississippi, which is a small rural congregation about 20 miles south of Monticello, Mississippi. And I'm here today to give you a message that I would normally have done in church, but because we are in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, everything has been turned upside down, and we're now going to be giving our messages probably for a while over the internet. So today is April 5th, 2020, Sunday, and this is Palm Sunday. And of course this is probably going to be a different kind of Palm Sunday as we try to get through this pandemic. We'd love to have you drop by. We have worship at 11 o'clock, and of course Sunday school before then at 10 a.m. when this is all over. Of course, one of the things that we're doing today is I'm going to attempt to give you a message over the video in view of the fact that we are facing a worldwide pandemic with COVID-19. Mississippi has currently about 1,600 cases with about 43 deaths, and we certainly mourn those deaths and certainly want to pray for each and every family that is affected by this, as well as the people of New York and other major cities where this virus is entering in. We want to be in prayer for the hundreds of thousands of people that have been affected by this virus. Certainly the year 2020 will be remembered as the year of the great pandemic of COVID-19, just like it was almost 100 years ago for the 1919 Spanish flu pandemic, where almost at least 50 million people died, and upwards, some people say 100 million, and where 674,000 people in the United States also died. And it was something that the world has never forgot. So we're experiencing something that is totally brand new for our generation. The entire world is engulfed in this. Everybody is probably talking about it. Every sector of life has been affected. And it is something that I think is a wake-up call for us as Christians, and certainly the argument is ever more stronger as to whether we are in the last days. Certainly this is probably could be considered a pretty big birth pang. Nevertheless, this is April 5th, 2020, and this is Passover Sunday. How are we to look at Passover, and also as we experience this pandemic, what should be our attitude, and how are we to respond to this as Christians, as well as how are we to pray through this? So I'd like to share with you some thoughts I have on the Passover, as well as passing through experiences like this. By words of introduction, as you look back through the Old Testament, you know, the Old Testament has a lot of laws on cleanliness. And so a lot of our authorities, especially in these days and weeks, have been emphasizing some of the very basic things like washing hands, keeping surfaces clean, and quarantining ourselves and not going out, possibly getting infected by this virus. And if you look back at the Old Testament, you know, God had a lot of laws on cleanliness and how to deal with certain situations, ritual washings and things like that. If you look through Leviticus 11 chapters 11 through 15, that gives you all of that kind of information. And from a medical perspective, this really makes sense. And I think as you look back at the Old Testament and these laws, they were way ahead of the game. And you know, you might think, well, God was kind of being mean as He brought all these kind of different kinds of rules on them. But basically, I think what God was trying to do was to save their lives. And God said, if you follow all of my instructions, your life your life will be saved, and you will avoid the plagues that I'm bringing on the rest of the nation. So I think it makes sense that we do as the authorities say. And of course, we're not having church in our sanctuary and gathering together more than 10 people, not even at all, during these days. And our services have been canceled indefinitely until we get through this pandemic. But from a medical perspective, you know, looking back at the Old Testament, it really makes sense that these things were something that God taught them, and now we're having to really do them to almost a religious degree. God talked about them about being careful what you would put in your body, being careful about what you touched. Of course, there was a lot of prohibitions against touching a dead body, and if you did, you had to make sure that you were clean. And there were even instances where God says, lay things out in the sun. And we've heard some studies that the ultraviolet rays of the sun can kill this virus. And also, cleaning up if there were certain kinds of different situations. And there was a doctor back in the 1840s. It dawned on him that many of his aides had been coming from the morgues and places where they'd been handling dead bodies, and they were not washing their hands. So then he put out the rule, everybody that comes from these places, and if you're going to be helping women in birth, need to wash their hands. And he says there was an 80% survival rate after that happened. So we're finding these things out. And so, like I said, the Old Testament was way ahead of its time. But how do we go through this kind of experience that we are experiencing? This is something, like I said, it's totally new to our generation, and something that we should have never experienced. What should our attitude be? As we think about Passover, we certainly want Passover to be applied to us. Passover is certainly, the week of Passover was certainly the highlight of Jesus' life. He was finally recognized as a king by many of the common people, although the authorities and the religious authorities especially did not recognize him. And yet he was a different kind of king. He was a humble king, maybe you could say a secretive king. He was born in obscurity. Almost no one knew about his birth, except for a few shepherds and wise men. Of course, we know now because we have the Bible, but almost really no one knew about his birth. And yet he was someone who was in the line of David, and certainly had the legal right to be recognized as the King of Israel. But when Jesus came about, there was no kingdom really to speak of. The Israelites had been overrun by the Romans, and the former glory of David had all but disappeared. There was no palace. There was no great army. There were no riches or fame to the kings. There was nothing. And so Jesus basically was born into a family that had nothing in comparison to what they should have had, being a family in the line of David. But Passover was a time to remember the great deliverance of God from the oppression of the Israelites, and also the plagues that God had sent upon the enemies of the Israelis, the Egyptians at that time. And each Jewish family was instructed to shut themselves up in their houses, to not go out, and to put the blood of a lamb on the doorpost of their houses. And if they did that, if they followed the instructions of the Lord in that way, that the death angel would pass over them. Of course, the greatest, the last plague was the plague of death that killed the firstborn of all the Egyptians, but it did not kill the firstborn of the Israelites if they took the instructions of the Lord to heart. So certainly in the view of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, we would like for this to pass over us, and that it would not affect us individually or affect our families. So this is something that we would like to be applied to us. Solomon, when he was dedicating the temple, and he was most famously known for building the temple of God, he prayed a great prayer, and after that prayer it says fire came down from heaven and burned up the offerings that were there and the sacrifice, and it says the glory of the Lord was so powerful, there was so much smoke in the temple that the priests could not enter in. And it says all the people saw that and they shouted, "The Lord is good, He is good, His love endures forever." But later on, God appeared personally to Solomon, and He appeared to personally respond to that prayer. And He appeared to him, it says, in the night in a dream. And this is what the Lord said to Solomon. He said, "I've heard your prayer, and I've chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices." And he said, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or to send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn, it says, from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin. Not only that, but to heal their land. I think that COVID-19 is a wake-up call. Maybe, perhaps, as we look across the nation and even into our individual lives, there are things that we may need to reassess. We may need to reprioritize, and we may need to even confess and to ask God to forgive us and to forgive our nation and to heal our land. Now, sometimes you think, well, am I saying that this is a plague from God? Well, all of life, and we experience these things from week to week, on month, and every year we experience natural disasters. And the truth is that the life that we live here on this planet is a place of wrath. The physical realm of this world has been judged, and there is trouble in this world. But that does not mean that we necessarily are condemned in our souls to death, but it means that this world is passing away, and there will be things like this. And when they happen, we should think about it, and it should be an opportunity to reassess our lives. God allows sometimes these things to happen so that we will reassess our lives and make corrections as necessary. But of course, God always will hear the prayer of the penitent. But of course, he left the warning for Solomon: if you disobey my word, he said, then I will reject his temple, and if you forsake the Lord, then and embrace other gods and worship them, then all these disasters that fell upon them will fall upon you. Again, maybe this pandemic is a wake-up call for our nation and the world. Could it be that this is something that God is allowing in order to correct the pathway of our lives and even in our nation? Nevertheless, even after the great deliverance of the Passover, God asked the Israelites to pass through the Red Sea and to go on and fight for the Promised Land. They had to pass through the Promised Land. They had to confront the enemies of God. And remember, these cultures and people were tremendously debased and evil. They were sexually perverse and violent, practicing even things like child sacrifice. And certainly many Israelites lost their lives, but more often when they did, they failed. It was because they failed to obey the voice of God. Even Jesus himself had to pass through the experiences of this life and this earth, and ultimately the cross. Jesus himself did also ask for a Passover. He asked that the cup of suffering might be removed from him, but said nevertheless that he would do God's will, and he was obedient and faithful unto death. And in the end, he would rise to a victorious resurrection and glory, and would take the right hand of the throne of God. Many times, even though we ask God for something to pass over us, he sometimes may ask us to go through it. And so there are occasions where God will allow us and will ask us to go through things in life. And many of you could probably look back on your life and you have gone through some hard experiences. Even then, we can depend on the fact that God will be with us and that he will not tempt us beyond our ability to go through. And God will provide. As an example, when Elijah suddenly was afraid for his life as he ran from Jezebel, he came to a desert and was about to cross the desert, and an angel appeared to him and said, "The journey is too great for you. You cannot make it." And the angel provided food and water, and Elijah rested before he made that great journey. And again, God doesn't allow us to be tempted, yet God knows our ability. He knows what we can stand. And the key is that sometimes, and many times, we do not, but God knows what we can stand. We may argue about God when we have to go through certain things in life, but He can always bring His grace and His presence into it. Things like COVID-19 remind us that we live in a land where there is the shadow of death. Unfortunately, many thousands and hundreds of thousands of people have been affected by this virus, and many thousands have died because of this virus. I'm reminded of the words of Psalm 23. It says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me." And he says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So this is something that is causing the shadow of death to fall upon the land. That He will prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. And we heard about the fact that COVID-19 is an invisible enemy, and somehow God is going to help us and get our tables prepared, and He will help feed us, and that we will get through this. There are many times in our lives where we probably have had difficult experiences, and yet we look back and say, we got through that. And so one of the things that we can count on is that, well, if we have to pass through this, that it will pass. It will pass, and that this virus will get through it, and maybe it's going to take a lot longer than we think. A lot of the leaders have certainly admitted that they've underestimated the power of this virus, but certainly just as generations of the past got through things like the 1919 pandemic, we're going to get through this. But nevertheless, we want to continue to pray that this thing will pass over us and not affect our lives. There's another psalm, Psalm 91, that I think is made specifically for this kind of situation. And I've read it to my people, and I'd like to read it again and share it with the rest of you. Psalm 90 says, "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." And so we have the shadow of death that is going across the land. But those that dwell in the shelter of the Almighty, it says, what kind of shadow? They will have the shadow of the Almighty. It goes on to say, "I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and your rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrows that fly by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday." And of course, we are fearing this. This is something that seems to be in the darkness. We can't see it, and it even destroys right in the middle of day. Thousands of people are being affected, but nevertheless, it goes on to say, "1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked." It goes on to say, "The Lord is my refuge, and if you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you, no disaster will come near your tent, for He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone, and you will tread on the lion and the cobra, and trample the great lion and the serpent." And this is the part I like the most, the very last part of the psalm. It says, "Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue Him. I will protect Him, for He acknowledges my name. He will call upon me, and I will answer. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him, and I will honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation." So what kind of people do we need to be? We need to be the kind of people that love God. We need to be the kind of people that acknowledge the name of God. Right now is the greatest opportunity that we have in order to get the good news of the gospel out. It's sort of ironic that do this kind of thing and to give our messages on video, but now we can upload them to the World Wide Web, and anywhere in the entire world it is possible that they can see this message. Right now, pastors and churches and all kinds of Christian people have the opportunity to get this word out. and to tell people that even if they might be struck with this virus, even if they might die, there is hope in Jesus Christ for eternal life. This is the greatest message of the world that the whole world needs to hear, especially as we face this pandemic. So we would like to have a Passover, and we pray that this virus will pass over us, and I pray that this virus will pass over you and your family, and it will not harm your family. But are you calling upon the name of the Lord? Are you acknowledging His name? These things are important. Are you making God your shelter? Are you dwelling in the presence of the Almighty, and His shadow will overshadow all darkness? His presence will make all of the darkness go away. These are the kinds of promises that we have. But sometimes, again, God may ask us to pass through some kinds of experiences, hard experiences of life. And sometimes they are something that God allows so that we can be refined and so that there is corrective action taking place. But nevertheless, we still acknowledge that God is on the throne and that He is to be praised. The greatest, nevertheless, in the Bible was the friends of Daniel, the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they were faced with the great threat of a fiery death through the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who wanted them to bow down to an idol and to make them confess that they were not believers in the God of Jehovah, but they would bow down to this idol. And they said, "We know that God is able to deliver us, but even if He will not, they said, we want you to know, O King, that we serve the God of Jehovah." And it was one of the greatest testimonies of the entire Old Testament. And of course, we know the end of the story, that God did deliver them, and not even a smell of smoke was on their clothes, and it was a marvelous sight, and it convinced Nebuchadnezzar that God was real. These are the days, and we can take this opportunity to make God real to people. Maybe it is that we will not be delivered. Maybe it is that we might have to pass through this, and maybe it is that we know family and friends that are affected by this virus. But nevertheless, we as the people of God know our future, and this ought to give us a hope and a comfort. So I hope that as we experience this pandemic, you will remember that God is with you, and that He will get us through this, and that there will be yet days ahead where we can rejoice and be happy. But for now, it looks like that we're going to have to hunker down and get through this. But God is going to help us to get through this. May the Lord bless you and your family.